Hello, I'm Christopher Snedden. Welcome to Tushita Talks to the World. Today we're talking with Dr. Mohan Malick, who's a sinologist with a deep understanding of both China and its geopolitics. I've known Mohan for quite a while. We've worked together both in Melbourne and also in Honolulu, and he is a sinologist with profound understandings of this nation and its circumstances. Today's been a wonderful day at Tushita. It's almost been a spring day, and we're supposed to be in the middle of winter, but it's been very warm and mild, and lots of birds singing and sun shining, blossoms appearing. So very beautiful day where we are. Dr. Mohan Malick is actually a sinologist who goes back to 1983 when he studied Chinese language in Beijing at the Beijing Language Institute and also Beijing University. He also has a Master of Philosophy from Delhi University and a PhD from the Australian National University. He currently is a visiting fellow at the Near East and South Asia Centre for Strategic Studies at Washington, DC. And Mohan, like all of our conversationalists in Tushita Talks to the World, is offering his own opinions. They don't represent the opinions of any particular organisation, indeed of no organisation. They are his own opinions. So I hope you enjoy our conversation today with Dr. Mohan Malick about China and its geopolitical circumstances. Hi Mohan, it's great to have you here today on Tushita Talks to the World. China, of course, is dominating our thoughts at the moment, and we're very lucky to have you as a sinologist and world expert on China and its geopolitics to be with us here today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And I noted in that wonderful piece that you wrote for the Sunday Guardian Live the other day, which also appeared in an abridged form in the ASPI Strategist, about post-Wuhan world disorder, indeed, as you suggested, that one of the things that you talked about is that the coming decade is going to be a decade of living dangerously, that there's all sorts of potential, including conflict in the disputed Himalayas or in the Western Pacific. And one of the things that non-specialists who look at China think about China is that it's huge and that it's big and that it's got everything going for it, yet there must be some not only strengths but also some weaknesses. And I'd like to tease out a few of those weaknesses today. So if there is going to be conflict, one of the strengths of China is that it's a one-party ruled system. The Chinese Communist Party dominates that nation. On the other hand, is it a strength or a weakness that we're now talking about Xi Jinping becoming Chairman Xi, that he is now dominating that party and looks like he's going to dominate that party for a little while longer? Are we seeing that as a strength or a weakness, Mohan?
It's a weakness. It's no longer one-party rule, it's a one-man rule. As a well-known China expert, Jeremy Baumey calls Xi Jinping chairman of everything and COE of China. The reason China has become so assertive or aggressive and so pushy is because China is going to go through internal domestic challenges, and there are a lot of economic challenges that China faces, social challenges. Politically, if you look at China's history, whenever China was confronted with major domestic crisis, it lashed out at its neighbors, historically speaking. So China's domestic crises have always culminated in aggression against its neighbors. During the Great Leap Forward, or in the aftermath of the Great Leap Forward, India-China war, Sino-Soviet split. During the Cultural Revolution, the Red Guards, PLA Red Guards, sparked that conflict with the Soviet Union that led to a major realignment in terms of China's tilt toward the US. And during power transition, as Deng Xiaoping was trying to consolidate his control over power after the Gang of Four was overthrown after Mao Zedong's death, he sought to teach Vietnam a lesson. It's a different story that the PLA was taught a lesson by the Vietnamese. So whenever China has faced serious domestic, political, economic, social crisis, it has led to conflict with its neighbors. So that's what I mean when I say that the next decade is a decade of living dangerously for those that are on China's periphery, small and medium-sized nations on China's periphery with unresolved territorial disputes because of internal challenges that Xi Jinping faces. This is the first decade. After 4 decades, after 40 years of non-stop, very high, double-digit, 8% to 12% economic growth, China is experiencing economic slowdown, a serious economic slowdown, and that has social and political consequences. Unrest in different provinces, especially in minority provinces, what is happening in Xinjiang, Tibet, not to speak of, China is no longer one-party state. It's called surveillance state. If you go to China, China has installed more surveillance cameras than any other country in the world. So China's budget on domestic security, internal security, could be higher than its expenditure on defense. These are internal challenges.
So it's interesting in terms of the neighbours. China is like Russia. Both of those have 14 neighbouring states. And in terms of China picking on one of the smaller ones, which one would it be likely to pick on? And just before you answer that, in terms of the borders, the interesting factor in terms of India and China is that all of the China-India border is actually India-Tibet. It doesn't actually have any parts of, it doesn't border any of those other non-Tibetan states. Well, it's Xinjiang and Tibet, depending on how you look at the division of Jammu and Kashmir. So in terms of those smaller states, are we looking at a potential land conflict and or thinking maritime, some sort of a maritime conflict?
Small neighbors, we're looking at Nepal. China has made new territorial claims against Nepal and Bhutan. Nepalese press has reported, Chinese road building on Nepalese territory on Nepal-China border. Likewise, new claims have been made vis-a-vis Bhutan on its eastern frontier. Then you have Vietnam, Philippines, its maritime boundaries, Japan. So simultaneous activation of territorial disputes from Japan all the way to India tells you something that the regime in China is looking for external scapegoats to blame for domestic ills and to consolidate its hold over power. And that has been the norm. This is to distract people, to rally people behind the flag or around the flag. Chinese leaders have resorted to aggression against their neighbors.
Yeah, in your article, you talked about that. You talked about China's motivations being larger territory, absolute power, and obeisance from all. And also reflected were creeping aggression, Han supremacy, and tributary relationships. So in terms of the Quad and the inclusive Quad, plus the D10 that you mentioned, the 10 democracies and all of those sort of things, and the very interesting one that you mentioned to counter that, this so-called PRIC, Pakistan, Russia, Iran, and China axis, which I think is very profound and also rather humorous at the same time. We're talking about power and hierarchy versus law and order and rules. Now, one of the dynamics in all of that, it's not just China-India, it's also China-US. And China-US, that relationship is a really dynamic one, and it could be a force for good, but at the moment seems to be a force for bad. Are you envisaging any changes there? Or even if Biden is elected president, is that relationship likely to change?
I don't think US-China relations are going to improve whoever gets elected in the next elections in the US. US and China are now embarked upon great power competition. Even before Trump took over, there were indications of that under President Obama. It was not overt rivalry, but competition was something that was talked about in policy documents that came out of US Defense Department. So there is little possibility that in terms of change in rhetoric, we can see some change in rhetoric. We can see at the moment there's complete breakdown in terms of US-China relations. There could be some of the dialogues could be reinstituted between US and China if Biden gets elected. But as far as economic decoupling is concerned in high-tech sectors, there is no going back on that. We are going to live in one world, two systems. In terms of high technology, AI, artificial intelligence, robotics, 5G, 6G, US and China are going to go their separate ways, mainly because new emerging technologies have serious national security implications. So they will continue to stay connected. China and US economies will be interdependent when it comes to low-cost manufacturing, but as far as high-tech sector is concerned, you're going to see a decoupling no matter who gets elected in November elections. In terms of what is driving this, up until recently, US hoped that just as it turned its former enemies, rivals, Japan, Germany, into partners, as friends, it could turn China around too. So China would be a responsible stakeholder, would play by the rules of the system that US and its friends and allies have established post-World War II. That has not happened because anybody who's sought to change China, China has in turn changed that country too. China has its own game to play. So when China was weak, it paid lip service. It behaved as a nation state, just another nation state, kept its head down under Deng Xiaoping, leadership, hide and bite strategy, went along with the US, but at the same time, it was quite conscious that its time will come when it could assert itself. It focused on building economic, technological capabilities, learned from the Soviet Union. The one reason the Soviet Union disappeared from the map of the world because it was first world military power and a third world economic power. So Chinese leadership learned its lesson from the Soviet collapse and focused entirely on building economic, scientific, technological basis of its power. When China was weak, it used to talk about Asian century. It used to talk about multipolar world. As China's power has grown, all that talk of multipolarity has disappeared. Under Obama administration, China talked about new type of great power relationship, which meant cut a deal with us, US and China. So China's rhetoric shifted from multipolar world to US-China. new type of great power relationship, shared hegemony, condominium, G2. And under Xi Jinping, we have seen China moving away toward a unipolar world, Sinocentric, as a result of Belt and Road Initiative. Belt and Road Initiative is a huge initiative. It makes China the center of global economy, a kind of hub and spoke system that the US has, security alliances. China has put in place an economic hub and spokes, whereby China is a center of all global economic activity, and all these land transport corridors through Central Asia, all the way to Europe, railroads, highways, pipelines, and through China-Myanmar economic corridor, China-Pakistan economic corridor, through Southeast Asia, Maritime Silk Road. They will bring in natural resources, energy, raw materials into China, and manufactured goods from China will be exported to those countries and beyond. So this is Xi Jinping's vision of a Sinocentric unipolar order that
so in relation
rules
to
out accommodation, that rules out accommodation with other major power centers. So that's a major change that has occurred, and that's what is bringing US and China into coalition.
another very interesting thing that you talked about in your article was elite capture. Would you like to talk a little bit more about that? Because that's certainly something that it's not happening in Australia, but it's something that Australia is concerned about, the intrusive role that China plays, both amongst Chinese citizens and in terms of buying influence, supporting electoral campaigns or whatever, which you also mentioned in your article. How serious do we need to be about that?
When it comes to small states and middle powers, they are the first one to experience shifts in geopolitical power balance. Why? Because they come under pressure from rising powers, from great powers to big sides.
Yeah.
So what you are seeing in the next 15, 20 years, small and medium-sized nations coming under a lot of pressure, both from Beijing and from Washington, to pick sides in this new Cold War 2.0 that we are going to experience. So it's in that context that China is very important for China to have friends and allies. China is trying to draw countries closer into its orbit through economic incentives, inducements, and Belt and Road Initiative seeks to do that, widen its network of friends and allies. If you look at China does not have many friends and allies, with the exception of Pakistan, North Korea, and Cambodia. China does not have many friends and allies, and many would argue that these are not assets, these are more liabilities. If you're a great power. So China is trying to offer economic incentives through aid, infrastructure, trade, through the Belt and Road Initiative to countries to support China on key foreign policy issues and side with China. And we have seen that in the case of, human rights, UN Commission on Human Rights. We have seen the recent election of a Chinese judge in the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, so that countries are willing to support. 53 countries, have backed China on the Hong Kong issue, Uyghur problem. Many countries are not willing to speak out, criticize China.
Including Pakistan.
So money does buy silence or influence, and it's in that context, China is using its economic heft, economic influence to shape small and medium-sized countries' domestic politics and shape their foreign policy choices, behavior in China's favor. And small states increasingly find difficult to say no to China because of their, heavy debts that they have incurred as a result of China's investment in infrastructure projects and elite capture. Elite capture is, what is it? It basically means that China bankrolls election campaigns of major political parties. We have seen that in Nepal and in Sri Lanka, for example, in the Maldives too, and scholarship for their leaders' children. They are sent to China, or abroad for their education. Lavish gifts are offered, and you are seeing that in the South Pacific too, small islands, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Tonga, military exchanges, arms sales at friendship prices, and construction of high visibility infrastructure projects like Presidential Palace, Parliament House. So China is trying to influence top elites of small and medium-sized countries to ensure that no matter who comes into power after a change in leadership through elections or other means, they remain friendly to China and protect China's economic and security interests.
For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And one of the things you also said in your article is that the One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative, as it's also been called, has lost its sheen. And debt trap diplomacy and debt relief are now becoming issues. Certainly debt trap diplomacy is being recognised and debt relief is an issue. Now, Pakistan, for example, with CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, supposedly it's about $60 billion, and the transfer of technology was older technology. For example, the power stations they built were coal-fired. Most of the work done is done by Chinese labourers. There's very little use of Pakistanis, although the Pakistanis did develop a 10 or 15,000 man force to protect the Chinese, which was also interesting. But are we likely to see things like nations renouncing debt, saying, sorry, we just can't pay it, and just forgetting about it? Now, I know Sri Lanka tried to do that and they refinanced Hambantota and gave China some access to that and some land and this, that and the other as part payment of their debt. But are we likely to see nations just saying, no thanks, we've had enough? And what can China do if these nations renounce these debts and say, well, bad luck, China, come and get it if you want to? Pakistan, for example,
Yeah, I mean, we discussed earlier, what China's vision is, where China wants to go, and what kind of China wants to have influence in those countries. But this is the downside, and this is one of the crises that China is going to face. Xi Jinping's signature initiative, One Belt, One Road, is going to be a major casualty of economic crisis, economic slowdown, and the global pandemic unleashed by COVID-19. Even before this pandemic broke out, the Belt and Road projects had lost their sheen. There were many countries that were looking at renegotiating terms of loans that were offered to China. Malaysia under Mahathir did that, Burma, Myanmar also renegotiated Chakhu port. China wanted to build that port for $10 billion. Burmese government brought it down to 1.5 instead of building 8 jetties. I mean, Burma does not have a navy to speak of. So they brought it down to just construction of 2 jetties at the Chakhu port for 1.5 billion. Sri Lanka did the same. Nepal was asking for the same. Pakistan, Kenya, and a number of countries, were putting pressure on China before this pandemic. So some of these projects had lost their sheen, and Chinese had come under pressure to renegotiate. And also these countries were being offered alternatives to China's infrastructure plan. Japan came up with Asia-Africa Growth Corridor in collaboration with India. US also got its act together and offered its own assistance to countries, under different schemes. So as long as countries did not have options, they welcomed Chinese aid and investment in infrastructure projects. But once they got, alternatives to China's, that placed them in a better position to renegotiate terms of those loan packages and that they had signed on to when there were not many options available to them. What we have seen is that Chinese infrastructure projects, investments, generate as much ill will as goodwill. They are good for countries that cannot get loans, assistance from the IMF and World Bank, conflict-torn countries like Pakistan or Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, but they are long-term costs. And with the pandemic, things are going to get worse. China cannot continue to throw money on projects which have very low returns on investment. So China is going to be much more circumspect because of its own economic slowdown. It doesn't have that much cash to throw at countries, at projects in distant countries.
So this could be this could be a form of strategic overreach or economic overreach as well.
Yes, economic overreach and the pressure to provide debt relief by either reducing loan interest rates or suspending interest payments for, say, Myanmar, Cambodia, Pakistan, Djibouti, Sri Lanka, Kenya, would take its toll on China's own fiscal situation. And history shows, that these grand infrastructure projects have often led to the collapse of great powers too. So this could be
when you say that. When you say that, who particularly are you thinking of? Great infrastructure projects have led to demise of great powers.
If you look at ancient the Khmer Kingdom, for example, is a very good example of that. So these, and Soviet Union was also engaged in those grand projects.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And Chinese Party has always taken great pride in huge infrastructure projects. And there are reports of Three Gorges Dam under a lot of strain and because of incessant rains the last few months. So some of these infrastructure projects could lead to setting up new capitals in, as you know, Indian history, led to the collapse of some dynasties in India. So the infrastructure projects could have caused empires to falter and founder, and that could happen in this case. And such one belt, one road will not survive. It will, because it's too big to fail completely. There will be elements of it that work to other countries' advantage. They would want to keep those projects going. I don't see there's going to be any reduction in terms of Chinese commitment to Pakistan. So China needs Pakistan as much as Pakistan needs China. But there are other countries that are not priority areas or countries for China, so that would see a reduction in Chinese financial commitments to those countries. So we're going to see this project will be tailored to meet with post-pandemic situation, and it will not be the same project that it was conceived in 2013 when Xi Jinping laid it out.
Interesting. So mentioning Pakistan, its neighbour, of course, is India, and India has been very clear that it doesn't want to join the One Belt, One Road initiative. It thinks it's exploitative and various other things. How do you, and the other thing that I remember you saying on more than one occasion, which is a very significant point, is that India's former ally, which used to be the Soviet Union, and it's since moved closely. They have a close strategic relationship with Russia, but it's not the same as it used to be. It's not unequivocal the way it used to be with India and the Soviet Union. How are you finding China-India relations, and what's your prognosis about the future of that particular relationship?
China and India are locked in this security dilemma, great power rivalry, just as US and China are faced with what is known as a Thucydides trap. Just as US does not want China to emerge as a peer competitor at the global level, China does not want India to emerge as a peer competitor at the regional level. So just as China is faced with US containment of its ambitions, China is likewise engaged in encirclement and containment of India's power. 70% of Chinese arms sales go to countries that border India: Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Nepal too. So these are the countries that are the largest recipients of economic assistance from China. China is the largest trading partner of these countries, having displaced India over the last decade or so, and a security partner too for these countries. Just as China accuses the US of hegemony, India accuses China of asserting hegemony in South Asia. So this relationship is going to be very conflictual, tension-ridden relationship. If they can avoid war, that will be the best case scenario, though there is a possibility of clashes breaking out on the disputed frontier. Mind you, this is the largest undemarcated boundary in the world. India-Pakistan conflict is only in Kashmir, a small patch of territory in one state. The rest of the border is international border recognized by both countries. When it comes to China-India boundary, from all the way from Myanmar, Burma to Pakistan, the boundary is not defined, delimited. And that's a potential, and Chinese want to keep it that way. They don't want to even exchange maps in terms of showing where in their perception the boundary lies, because this provides a very powerful leverage to the Chinese to keep India focused on its border with China, diverting scarce economic resources. And that leads in, remember, Modi was talking about achieving his goal of 5 trillion economy by 2024, when he goes to the electorate again for elections are going to be scheduled for 2024, next round. He's not going to achieve that. First came the pandemic from China, then came the PLA. So India is faced with 4 crises. It's not only power shifts, health crisis, economic crisis, but also the potential of war with China. And that will set India's economy back by,
so
if not a few years, by decades.
If there is a war, India has one advantage, and that's it can block the Malacca Strait and those sort of things. Are we likely to see that? And we're sort of getting towards the end now, unfortunately.
Well, they are putting in place measures. India has signed, logistics exchange agreement with Australia, and there's talk of, greater collaboration between Australia and Indian and Navy in the Eastern Indian Ocean. And Japan and India are going to hold virtual summit, and there are reports that they're going to reach a similar deal that will provide Indian Navy access to Japanese base in Djibouti, and Japanese Navy will gain access to Andaman Nicobar Islands. Australia and India, and Australia and Japan, Australia and Indonesia, Sabang port. So these are baby steps that are being taken to ensure that these 3 countries, and of course with the US too, US dispatched an aircraft carrier, to signal to China that it will support India in the event of a conflict. Then I'm pretty sure that Nixon must have turned in his grave. In 1971, Nixon and Kissinger sent an aircraft carrier to support China against India. And this time an aircraft carrier was dispatched in June to support India against China. So these are, all the steps that are being taken to signal, to prevent escalation of these current tensions into an all-out conflict between China and India. But also, if you look at Chinese military, no military, historically speaking, has spent so much for so long and not gone to war.
Yes.
China's defense expenditure, if you look at China's defense expenditure, it's more than all its neighbors put together: Russia, Japan, India, ASEAN, Korea, Taiwan, all these countries' defense expenditure is what China is spending on its military. And some wolf warrior generals, they are itching to, teach one of their weaker neighbors their lessons and signal China's rival as a great military power.
So, do you think that they'd be prepared to take on India? Because India has certain advantages, as does the US.
Yeah.
China has now the largest navy in the world, but in terms of air superiority, the US has that. And India, to some extent, has some superior air assets.
So it will lead to a stalemate. This cannot be a repetition of the 62 debacle, This will lead to a stalemate. And as we saw in the Galvan clashes, if 20 soldiers were killed, they also killed for 30 plus or 40 Chinese soldiers. So this is going to be a bloodbath if a war breaks out, because the Indian military is also itching to teach China a lesson. It works both ways. There are many Indian generals who want to put 62 behind them forever. And this provides an opportunity to India too to get even with China and to signal to other countries in Asia that they can't mess with, especially Pakistan, because 65 war with Pakistan came after 62. And if India loses to China, then there is a certainty that Pakistan will get emboldened and launch another bid to seize Kashmir from India. So this is that's why there is a possibility of this war, if it breaks out, becoming a two-front war. But India is certainly not prepared for two-front war. It can take on China in one-on-one, but if it becomes two-front war, then India is not able to cope with that. That's certainly that's a certainty that India doesn't have that ability to cope with two-front war.
Well, Mohan, I think we've just scratched the surface in many ways. Thank you so much for all of your thoughts today. You've been very kind, very generous, and they've been very interesting. And I really appreciate you being involved in Tushita Talks to the World. And I'm hoping that we'll have another opportunity to do this, because I always enjoy the way you think and what you say, and it's very stimulating. And there's just so much to talk about. So thank you again, Mohan. See you again sometime. Thank you very much. Speak to you again.